969 years. That is the number the book of Genesis gives for a single man's life, and it is written there with no more drama than a name in a ledger. Methuselah lived 969 years, and he died. No explanation, no wonder, no apology, just the number, and then the next name, and then the next. If you grew up hearing this, you were handed the surface of it. You were told the ancients lived a long time, and perhaps you were told the world was pure then, and you nodded, and the sermon moved on. But there is something in that list nobody points out from the pulpit. The numbers do not simply stop after the flood. They fall. They fall in a shape, generation after generation, from 950 to 600 to 400 to 200 to 175, until the whole line has come down out of the impossible and settled into something that looks disturbingly like the length of your own life. And in the middle of that collapse, before the water ever comes, God speaks one sentence about 120 years that scholars have been arguing over for 2,000 years. Because the key word in it appears nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible, and nobody alive is certain what it means. Here is the part that should unsettle you. The Bible tells you the numbers. It never once tells you why. Every explanation you have ever been given, every single one, from the pulpit, from the classroom, from the documentary, is a theory built on top of a silence. And the strangest evidence in the whole question is not in the Bible at all. It is a four-sided clay prism sitting in a glass case in Oxford, written down by Sumerian scribes who had never heard of Moses, which lists kings who ruled before a flood for tens of thousands of years each, and then breaks in half at the water, exactly the way Genesis does. If you want to walk through this with me, subscribe and turn on notifications, so the next piece of this story finds you when it comes. And leave a comment, and tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. So let us go back to the list, and count it properly, the way almost nobody ever does. Part 1. The Ledger of the Long-Lived. Open Genesis at the 5th chapter, and you are not reading a story. You are reading an accounting document. 10 names, from Adam to Noah, and each one processed through the same cold formula. He lived this many years, and he fathered a son, and he lived this many more years, and he had other sons and daughters, and all his days were this. And he died. Adam, 930. Seth, 912. Enosh, 905. Kenan, 910. Mahalalel, 895. Jared, 962. Then Enoch. And Enoch breaks the pattern twice over, and we will come back to him, because he is the strangest man in the chapter. Then Methuselah, 969, the longest life recorded anywhere in Scripture. Then Lamech, 777. Then Noah, 950. Notice what the text does not do. It does not marvel. It does not pause to say, and this was extraordinary. It does not explain. Nowhere in the entire Hebrew Bible does any author stop and account for why these men lived for the better part of a millennium. The silence is total, and the silence is the whole problem, because every voice you will hear in the rest of this, Jewish, Christian, ancient, modern, believing, skeptical, is a voice filling that silence. Now follow the numbers past the water into the 11th chapter and watch what happens, because this is the part that gets skipped. Shem, 600. Arpachshad, 438. Shelah, 433. Eber, 464. And then something gives way. Peleg, 239. Reu, 239. Serug, 230. Nahor, 148. Terah, 205. And then the men you actually know. Abraham, 175. Isaac, 180. Jacob, 147. Joseph, 110. It is a fall, and it is steep, and it is not quite tidy. Nahor drops to 148, and then his son Terah climbs back to 205, which is exactly the kind of wrinkle that a made-up curve would not have. But the direction is unmistakable. Something in the world of that text changes at the flood, and keeps changing afterward, and does not stop until the human lifespan arrives at a number you could read on a gravestone in your own town. The question is not whether the fall is there. The fall is there in black and white. The question is what the fall is. Part 2. the sentence that set the clock. Before the rain, before the ark, before any of it, God says one thing. It sits in the 3rd verse of the 6th chapter of Genesis, and it is one of the most fought-over sentences in the entire book. My spirit shall not, and here the Hebrew simply stops being translatable in man forever, for that he also is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. The word I skipped is yadon. It is a hapax legomenon, which is the scholar's term for a word that appears exactly once in the whole Hebrew Bible, and therefore has no second occurrence to check it against. We are guessing. The King James tradition guessed strive. My spirit shall not strive with man. The Greek translators, working centuries before Christ, guessed abide, and Jerome in Latin followed them. Others have argued for remain, or be humbled. The scholar Ephraim Spicer argued from Akkadian that it means protect, or shield. Claus Westermann leaned toward abide, and the translators of the New English Translation flagged the honest problem out loud, which is that if the word came from the root meaning to judge or contend, the form ought to look different than it does. So understand the situation clearly. The verse that supposedly announces the end of the long lifespans hangs on a verb that no living Hebrist can translate with confidence. Now the second problem, and this one is bigger. What does the 120 years count? There are 2 readings, both ancient, both defensible, and neither has ever won. The first reading says it is a cap. God is placing a ceiling on human life, and everything after this is the ceiling coming down. The second reading says it is a countdown. God is granting a reprieve, 120 years of grace before judgment falls, a stay of execution while Noah builds. Rashi, the great medieval commentator, passes on this reading in the plainest possible terms. God gives them another 120 years if they repent. Well, if not, he will wipe them from the earth. Ibn Ezra and David Kimhi read it the same way. And the reprieve reading has a problem of its own, which is arithmetic. Genesis says Noah fathered his sons at 500 and that the flood came in his 600th year. That is 100 years, not 120. Defenders answer that the sentence was spoken about 20 years before that, which is possible and unprovable. But the cap reading has a far worse problem, and it is the one that should have been taught to you and never was. If 120 is the new maximum human lifespan, then the Bible immediately and repeatedly breaks its own rule. Shem lives 600 years after this verse. Terah lives 205. Abraham lives 175. Isaac lives 180. Those are not marginal exceptions. Those are the central figures of the entire book, all of them sailing past a limit that was supposedly just imposed. Those who hold the cap reading answer that it was implemented gradually, that the ceiling descended over centuries rather than falling into place overnight, the way the warning in Eden that Adam would die in the day he ate played out over 930 years rather than in an afternoon. Their critics call that special pleading, a rescue not found in the text. And that is where the matter sits. 2 readings, both old, both serious, both with an unhealed wound in them. I am not going to resolve it for you, because it is not resolved. Part 3. The Kings Before the Water. Now leave the Bible entirely, and go to Oxford. In the Ashmolean Museum there is a clay prism about the height of your forearm, 4-sided, covered in cuneiform, catalogued as the Weld-Blundell prism. It was inscribed somewhere around 1800 years before Christ, and it carries the most complete surviving copy of a document scholars call the Sumerian king list. Understand what it is before you hear what it says. It is not a chronicle, and it was never meant to be neutral history. It is a political instrument. Its entire purpose is to argue that kingship is one single divine institution, lowered from heaven, held by one city at a time, passing down an unbroken chain that arrives conveniently at whoever paid the scribe. Keep that in your mind. And now hear the opening. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. And there, at Eridu, a king named Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, ruled 36,000. Then kingship moved to Bad Tabira, and Enmen-Lu'ana ruled 43,200 years, and after him Enmen-Gal-Ana, and after him Dumuzid the shepherd. Then Larak. Then Sippur. Then Shuruppak, where the last of them, Ubaratutu, ruled 18,600 years. 8 kings, 5 cities. The Penn Museum sums the whole antediluvian block, the way the tablet does. 5 cities before the flood, whose 8 fabulous kings ruled no less than 241,200 years. And then the list does something that will stop you cold if you know your Genesis. It breaks. Then the flood swept over. That is the line. And on the other side of that line, kingship is lowered from heaven a second time at a city called Kish, and the reigns immediately begin to shrink, down through the thousands, then the hundreds, then into numbers that look like real kings with real lifespans. A world of impossible ages. A flood. Then a shortened world. The same architecture as Genesis, written by scribes who had never heard the name of Abraham. And it goes further. A Babylonian priest named Berossus, writing in Greek around 290 years before Christ, gave his own version of the same tradition, and his version has 10 kings before the flood, not 8, reigning for a combined 432,000 years, ending with a flood survivor. 10 figures before the deluge. Genesis has 10 patriarchs from Adam to Noah. The 10-generation shape is shared. So what do we do with that? Here is where I have to be careful with you, because this is precisely the point where a channel like this one usually tells you what it means. And I am not going to, because the people who have spent their lives on these tablets do not agree. Thorkild Jacobson, who produced the standard critical edition of the King List back in 1939, argued that the whole pre-flood section was a later edition, spliced onto a list that originally began after the water. Others, Jean-Jacques Glasner, Piotr Steinkeller, Johnny Marchesi, stress how thoroughly fictional and ideological the document is, and warn against harmonizing it with anything. The Egyptologist and historian Kenneth Kitchen argued for a shared cultural inheritance, a common Near Eastern way of telling the story of the world's beginning, rather than anybody copying anybody. Others point to something simpler and stranger, which is that both traditions may be counting in the same number system, and we will get to that. And the geologist Carol Hill, who has written on the numbers of Genesis, put the honest position plainly, that there remains no demonstrable relationship between the two beyond a superficial similarity. Borrowing, inheritance, coincidence, shared arithmetic, 4 live options, and no consensus. What is not in dispute is the parallel itself. Somebody in the same corner of the world, in the same deep past, was telling the story of a world whose ages ended when the water came. Part 4. The 7th man and the 7th king. Go back to that list of 10 patriarchs and count to 7. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, and Enoch. He is the 7th. And Enoch does not fit the chapter he is in. Every other man in Genesis 5 dies, and the text says so in the same flat formula. Enoch does not. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That is all. And his number is not a 900-something like his father's and his son's. Enoch lived 365 years. 365. The number of days in a solar year, attached to the one man in the list who does not die, but is taken up. If that were the only thing, you could call it a coincidence and sleep well. It is not the only thing. Go back to the Sumerian king list and count to 7. Alulam, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Enmengal-ana, Dumuzid, Enzipadzid-ana, and 7th, Enmedarana, sometimes given as Enmedaranki. And Enmedarana rules at Sippar. Sippar was the city of Shamash, the sun god. Mesopotamian tradition remembers Enmedaranki as the king who was taken up into the presence of the gods and given the secrets of divination, and who founded the guild of diviners who carried that knowledge afterward. The 7th figure. The sun. A man taken up and given heavenly knowledge. This is not a fringe observation. James Vanderkam, one of the leading scholars of the Enoch literature, and the Norwegian scholar Helge Fonvig and John Collins have all argued that the biblical 7th man is in some way patterned after or in conversation with the Mesopotamian 7th king. The scholar Lloyd Bailey said flatly that Enoch's 365 is no accident. And when you get to the later Enochic writings, the ones outside the canon, the Book of Enoch, the astronomical book, what is Enoch doing? Calendars, sun and moon, and the length of the year. The tradition kept the solar thread running for centuries. Now what that correspondence means is, once again, a matter of argument, and I will not pretend otherwise. But it is worth sitting inside the strangeness of it for a moment, because it is a real thing in the record, and not something anyone invented for a thumbnail. 2 lists, from 2 peoples. 10 figures before a flood in one strand of the tradition. and in both, at the seventh position, a man who does not simply die like the others, but is taken. There is one more small thing in that chapter, easy to miss. Lamech, the ninth man, lives 777 years. And 2 chapters earlier there is another Lamech, in the line of Cain, who boasts that if Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech will be avenged 70 and sevenfold. 7, 77, 777. Whatever else the numbers in Genesis are doing, they are not only doing arithmetic. Which brings us to the harder question, and the calmer half of this. Part 5. 3 Bibles, 3 sets of numbers. Here is something I suspect you were never told, and it changes the shape of the whole discussion. There is not one set of these numbers. There are 3. The Hebrew text that stands behind your English Bible is the Masoretic text. But there is also the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures made in the centuries before Christ and quoted throughout the New Testament. And there is the Samaritan Pentateuch, preserved by the Samaritan community. All 3 contain Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. All 3 disagree about the ages, and they do not disagree randomly. In Genesis 5, the Septuagint adds exactly 100 years to the age at which 6 of the patriarchs father their sons, and then subtracts exactly 100 from the years they live afterward, so that the total lifespan comes out identical. Adam is 930 in all of them, but in the Greek he becomes a father at 230 rather than 130, and the pattern has holes in it that are themselves revealing. Jared does not get the extra 100. Methuselah in the Greek is actually lower than in the Hebrew. Lamech gets 6 years rather than 100. Scholars going back to Ralph Klein noticed why that might be. Adding 100 to those particular 3 would have pushed their deaths past the flood, producing a visible contradiction, which suggests to a lot of people that somebody was adjusting, carefully, add it all up, and the traditions give you 3 different worlds. From Adam to the flood, the Hebrew gives 1,656 years. The Samaritan gives 1,307. The Greek gives more than 2,200. From Adam to Abraham, the Hebrew gives about 2,000 years. The Samaritan about 2,250. And the Greek nearly 3,400. A difference of some 13 centuries between 2 ancient Bibles. The Greek even has an extra man in the list, Cainan, standing between Arpachshad and Shelah, who is absent from the Hebrew and from the Samaritan, and who appears, of all places, in the genealogy of Jesus in the 3rd chapter of Luke. Which one is original? That is a genuine, ongoing, published argument. The mainstream text-critical position, associated with Ronald Hendel's work on the text of Genesis, and with Ralph Klein before him, treats the Hebrew as closest to the original here in the Greek and Samaritan as later revisions. Gordon Wenham summarized the state of things by saying there is no consensus except that the Greek looks secondary. But a serious minority, Jeremy Sexton in the Westminster Theological Journal, Henry Smith, working with Associates for Biblical Research, argues the reverse, that the Greek preserves the original chronology and the Hebrew was deliberately shortened later. Andrew Steinman has argued back against them. It is live, and here is the detail that ought to be famous and is not. The Dead Sea Scrolls cannot settle it. Among all the biblical manuscripts from Qumran, not one preserves the disputed age numbers of Genesis 5 or 11. There is a fragment that preserves the name Kenan, and no figure attached to it. That is what we have. The oldest evidence we possess for the most argued numbers in the Bible does not survive. So when someone tells you with total confidence how many years there were between Adam and Abraham, the honest answer is that the 3 oldest witnesses we have give 3 different answers, and the manuscript that might have refereed between them is dust. Part 6. The theory that the numbers were never biography. So, if the numbers are not straightforward biography, what are they? The oldest serious alternative, and it is much older than modernity, is that they are meaningful rather than measured, that they encode something. The Mesopotamian world counted in 60s. That is where our 60 minutes and our 360 degrees come from, inherited across 4,000 years. And the reign lengths on that Sumerian prism are not random at all. They are counted in units the Sumerians called the Sar, 3,600, and the Ner, 600. 28,800 years is 8 Sars exactly. The numbers are arithmetic in a base we no longer use. Carol Hill, in a paper called Making Sense of the Numbers of Genesis, published in Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith, argued that the Genesis ages work the same way. that they resolve into combinations of 60 and 7, the sacred numbers of that world, where a figure could carry a real meaning and a symbolic meaning at once, and where 120 being twice 60 simply signified a long span. And she noticed something in the digits. Take all 30 age numbers from Adam to Noah, and not one of them ends in 1, 3, 4, 6, or 8. By her calculation, the odds of that happening by chance are around 1 in a billion. Umurukasuto did early work along these lines. The Assyriologist Dwight Young published mathematical studies of the Sumerian dynastic spans and of the antediluvian numbers. Donald Wiseman worked the same ground. Their case is that we are reading a numerical language, fluently spoken by everyone who first heard these texts, and completely lost to us. Their critics answer, reasonably, that a determined person can find a pattern in almost any small set of numbers, and that claims about sacred arithmetic are very hard to disprove. Then there is the other version of this idea, the one that circulates most widely online, which is that the years are not years, that they are months or seasons, and the ages simply need converting. Divide Methuselah's 969 by 12 and you get 80. Problem solved. Except it is not. And the objection is fatal, and it is right there in the text. Because the same chapter tells you how old each man was when he fathered his son. Run Enoch through the month conversion and he becomes a father at roughly 5 years old. Run Adam through it and he is about 11. Try seasons instead, and you fix some ages and break others. Noah is fathering children at 125. The theory saves the deaths and destroys the births. And here is my favorite detail in this entire investigation. That is not a modern refutation. Augustine of Hippo considered exactly this theory in the 15th book of the City of God, 1600 years ago. The proposal that the ancient year was a tenth of ours, examined it and rejected it for essentially the same reason. Augustine also did something else in that book that almost nobody quotes. He confronted the Greek and Hebrew discrepancy head-on, admitted he could not account for it, and observed that whatever the disagreement over the fathering ages, the traditions agree about the longevity itself. A church father, in late antiquity, staring at the same textual problem we just walked through, and saying plainly that he did not know. Part 7. The sky that was supposed to protect them. The most physical explanation, and for a long time the most popular one in conservative circles, was that the world itself was different. The idea is called the vapor canopy. It holds that before the flood, a layer of water vapor surrounded the earth above the atmosphere, shielding the people below from radiation, raising the pressure and the oxygen, producing a mild global climate. And that when it collapsed, it both supplied the rain and ended the long lives. It was developed at length by Joseph Dillow in a book called The Waters Above, published in 1981, building on earlier flood geology writing. For a generation, it was everywhere in Christian bookstores. And here is the part that almost never gets reported, and that I think you deserve to know. The movement that popularized it has abandoned it. Not skeptics, not critics, its own side. The atmospheric physicist Larry Vardaman, working at the Institute for Creation Research, modeled what such a canopy would actually do, and the answer was catastrophic. A canopy holding enough water to account for the flood rains would trap heat on a scale that would have made the surface uninhabitable. On the numbers in Dillow's own model, the atmospheric temperature at collapse rising by thousands of degrees. To keep the earth from cooking you would need the sun burning at a fraction of its actual output. Answers in Genesis, the largest young earth organization in the world, now states the conclusion in its own words, that whether examined through the lens of Scripture or of science, the canopy theory fails to meet the standard of a robust explanation, and that most researchers and apologists have abandoned the various models. There was a scriptural objection, too. A psalm written long after the flood still speaks of waters above the heavens, which is difficult if those waters all fell, and to Dillow's credit, he had written that if the physics did not hold. The theory should be readily abandoned. It did not, and it was. There are successor arguments. The geneticist John Sanford has argued for what he calls genetic entropy, that harmful mutations have accumulated in the human genome since the flood, degrading it, shortening life. Others appeal to a population bottleneck and founder effects after the flood. The bottleneck concept is real population genetics. Its application to century-long lifespans is speculative, and genetic entropy as a whole population phenomenon is rejected by mainstream geneticists. I am telling you what these arguments are and who makes them, and I am telling you where the evidence does not carry them. The plain situation is this. There is no geological record of a vanished canopy, and there is no skeletal record anywhere on Earth, not in Mesopotamia, not anywhere, of a human being who lived for centuries. That is not an argument against the text. It is simply the state of the physical evidence, and pretending otherwise would be exactly the kind of thing this channel exists not to do. Part 8. The curve that bends towards 70. So let us come down gently, and finish where the numbers finish. Plot the lifespans after the flood on a curve, and something does emerge. 950, then 600, then the 400s, then the 200s, then Abraham at 175, Moses at 120, Joshua at 110, and by the time of the Psalms. A line that every older reader knows in their bones. The days of our years are 80 years and 10, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow. 70, 80 at the outside. That psalm is attributed to Moses himself, the same Moses who, we are told, died at 120 with his eye undimmed and his natural force unabated. Whether that curve is a biological record or literary shape is, once again, not something I can settle. The trend is real. The dataset is tiny and it wobbles, and which of the 3 ancient texts you use changes the numbers, and a smooth decline is exactly what you would expect, whether the cause were physical or whether a writer were shaping a descent from the impossible to the ordinary. There is one last coincidence, and I want to hand it to you carefully, because it is the kind of thing that gets oversold. The longest human life ever verified belonged to a Frenchwoman named Jeanne Calment, who died in 1997 at 122 years, and 164 days, and who remains the only person on record to have reached 120 at all. In 2016, a paper in Nature by Xiaodong, Brandon Milholland and Jan Vage argued that human lifespan has a natural ceiling somewhere near 115. 5 separate teams published rebuttals in the same journal the following year, disputing the statistics. That argument is not over. So the honest way to say it is this. The oldest verified human being on record lived to 122, and the Bible's most famous number for the limit of human life is 120. And whether that is meaningful or simply one of the coincidences that a world full of numbers will occasionally produce is not something anyone can demonstrate. It is a resonance. It is not a proof. And that leaves us, at the end, holding exactly what the text gave us at the beginning. The numbers are certain, and the reasons are not. Genesis records 969 years for Methuselah with the same flat certainty that it records 70 for a man in the Psalms, and it never explains the distance between them. Everything in between, the symbolism, the sexagesimal counting, the shortened years, the canopy, the mutations, the curve, is a human being standing in front of a silence and offering an answer. Some of those answers are careful. Some have already been withdrawn by the people who made them. None has won. And there is something almost fitting in that, because the men in that chapter are not remembered for how long they lasted. Enoch is remembered for walking. Noah is remembered for building. The years are only the ledger, the lives are the story. But there is a thread in this we have not pulled, and it has been sitting in front of us the whole time. Methuselah, the longest lived man in the Bible, dies in the year the flood comes. Not before it, not after it, in it. Some hold that his name itself is a sentence, that it means when he dies it shall be sent, and that the oldest man who ever lived was all along a clock counting down to the water. Others say the Hebrew will not bear that weight at all. That is the next place this story goes.